How the brain works. The brain, which also houses the self with its goals, interprets all information and makes all decisions according to its internal goals, which include both cognitive and intuitive components. The brain is in control and drives the individual. It's not that the brain exists on the one hand and the self on the other, but rather the self is integrated within the brain and plays its role from within it. And to prevent a widespread misconception, consciousness is not the self. The brain is an interpreter. It interprets the world and events in a way that aligns with its goals. Its task is to interpret perceptions and sensations, i.e., information, according to its internal goals and to generate corresponding attitudes and instructions for action. It doesn't simply reflect the world, but shapes it, according to its goals. This occurs through its midpoints, neural networks. This also includes anticipating alternatives and, among other things, asking the conscious mind what the consequences of each problem solution might be, so that it experiences these consequences and transmits information to the brain, unless it already believes it knows the consequences based on stored similarities. To reiterate, the brain doesn't simply reflect the world, but shapes it, according to its goals. This is accomplished by neural networks, midpoints. All decisions for each individual are made by the brain in the head, the autonomic nervous system, plus the somatic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system, the brain in the gut. A constant exchange of information takes place between these systems via neural networks. Anyone who has ever been to a research facility where the continuous firing of neurons is made audible gets an impression of the countless processes occurring in the brain. The general pattern of the brain is similarity. When an impulse, question, or demand arises, the brain first searches for something appropriate. The brain is subject to physical and chemical laws. As mentioned, it operates according to similarities, themes, and goals, with their midpoints controlling it. It consists of various areas, such as the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and cerebellum. Certainly, for example, the eyes primarily activate the visual cortex, occipital lobe, in the brain, hearing activates the auditory cortex, and so on, but simultaneously, neural networks, midpoints, are also activated. The former are physical reactions, the latter are psychological. It is important to understand that these areas never operate in isolation, but always interact with others through neural networks. These networks, in turn, are connected to many other networks, so that ultimately the entire brain, the autonomic nervous system, plus the somatic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system, the gut brain, are interconnected. All networks originate from goals. The neurons located within each network are not only bound to these goals but can also be used for other purposes via synapses. Networks are particularly activated by essential information received. Emotions, which are always stimulated in parallel within the respective networks, are of particular importance. They are especially well suited to guiding human behavior. This functional process occurs due to the respective similarities in the brain, which only partially incorporate new information. Like everything else, the brain also operates according to substances governed by laws. As mentioned, the goals of the self are also located in the brain. The self consists of a relatively small set of goals, which, however, constitute a significant part of the brain in terms of their value. Through will and perceptual information, it can strengthen or weaken goals, thus influencing other goals in the brain via the midpoint mechanism of the volitional goal. However, when one desires something, a goal can indeed be activated or generated, but whether this has an effect is determined by the psyche and the respective midpoints of the brain that are activated at that time. We do not experience ourselves as beings controlled by the brain because we do not perceive its processes, except for the decisions themselves. Their complexity and speed make them imperceptible. Therefore, we have the impression that we decide for ourselves, with our free will and our consciousness. Not least for this reason, the prevailing view is that humans control themselves with their consciousness and that the brain is merely an instrument. Thus, we experience what our senses convey to us via the brain. People see and feel the result of their thoughts and actions and believe they created it themselves, as mentioned, of their own free will or with their conscious awareness. They are mistaken. Their brain created it. Because if you look more closely, you learn that you are not something separate from your brain, observing it from the outside, but rather that you are integrated within it. When you observe yourself, the object of observation, which has formed as a midpoint within the brain, is essentially observing the brain itself. I would like to emphasize again that consciousness, in particular, does not control people. This becomes clear when you take a closer look at consciousness, which is merely a provider of information for the brain, so that it can make better decisions. Ultimately, something can only occur to someone from within their own brain. Even if something from the environment occurs to you, it is always up to the brain to decide what value it might have in order to be taken into account. Someone once asked if we are slaves to our brains. My answer: the brain is not something alien, separate from the self, as the question implied. Without the brain, we are nothing. With the brain, we are everything we feel, think, experience, and so on, every day. This is also where all the goals that the self wants to achieve reside. And this will of the self, with its midpoints and through their mechanics, can, with sufficient practice and a favorable psyche, more or less guide the brain into corresponding structures. One could only speak of slavery here if one has a weak will, or if a strong goal suppresses other, healthy, goals in the long run. Everything we perceive, recognize, absorb, think, and think about can form goals that reinforce others or generate new ones. Every new goal creates or strengthens synapses, neural networks that then work to achieve this goal. As soon as a goal has formed, it can play a role in the psyche. The brain is constantly learning, through the strengthening and formation of new synapses. That's why it's so important for the brain to remain flexible, which is, of course, also a goal. When a goal is activated, for example, when you want to grasp a glass, a learned cluster of neural networks comes into play. This involves various areas of the brain to accomplish this task, estimating the distance to the glass, its size, its weight, which muscles and their strength are needed to lift it, and so on. This is brain activity that seems natural to us and usually occurs without conscious awareness. If you observe two people having a lively conversation, how they speak, their body language, their facial expressions, the way they move their eyes, etc., you can't help but marvel at what the brain, and only the brain is responsible for it, is capable of and does. All of this originates from midpoints that are more or less coordinated and aligned with one another. Consciousness, or rather, perception, simply sends information to the brain, which then integrates it into behavior according to its perceived value. As a rule, automatic, learned behaviors are used. It is often forgotten that humans are also living beings that develop from inorganic substances and, like them, are governed by laws. The essential difference between humans and other living beings is their brain, with its capacity to form exorbitant neural networks that allow them to recognize laws and create new processes. And, with which they can be conjured up an infinite number of imaginary constructs.